My name is Vorux, Senior Observer. 42 cycles of service to the Galactic Council. 42 cycles of watching species stumble through their first sessions like frightened hatchlings who have never seen a star up close. I have watched the Plakari delegation faint 3 times during their admission ceremony. I have watched the Dervok High Chancellor accidentally sit on the Orion Compact's sacred ceremonial scroll and then spend 11 minutes apologizing in the wrong language. I have watched empires crumble, treaties dissolve, and one particularly embarrassing incident involving the Slorvan ambassador and a potted plant that we agreed, by unanimous vote, to never speak of again. Nothing could have prepared me for the humans. Let me paint you a picture of how this was supposed to go. The admission of a new species to the Galactic Council follows a procedure that is exactly 4,216 years old. It does not change. It does not bend. It does not accommodate. The new species arrives. The new species is silent. The new species listens to the opening address of universal kinship, which runs approximately 6 hours and 40 minutes. The new species signs the Compact of Shared Skies. The new species is given a seat at the lower table. The new species speaks when spoken to. That is it. That is all. That is the entire procedure. The humans had a different plan. I was at my observation post when their shuttle docked. Standard Terran vessel. Nothing unusual. I checked my datapad. 3 delegates as requested. Names listed as follows. Delegate First Class, Amara Osei. Cultural Liaison, Fyodor Belkin. And the one listed simply as Technical Advisor. A woman named Kesi Oduya. Kesi. Oduya. I did not know this name would haunt me for the rest of my career. The docking bay doors opened. The 3 humans walked in. And the very first thing that happened, was that Fyodor Belkin looked up at the ceiling of the Council's Grand Arrival Hall, which is carved from the bones of the Founder's Comet, and has made every single species to ever enter it go completely and utterly silent in awe. He said, and I am quoting directly from the audio log. Reminds me of my uncle's basement. He also never turned on enough lights. The Zorathi honor guard standing at the door turned to look at me. I turned to look at my assistant Palvi. Palvi turned to look at the floor. None of us had a response ready. The 3 humans walked forward. Amara Osei, the first-class delegate, was calm, professional. She had clearly read the briefing materials. She walked with the measured confidence of someone who understood the gravity of the occasion. Kesi Oduya was typing on a small device while walking. She did not look up once. Fyodor Belkin was reading a physical book, an actual paper book, in the Grand Arrival Hall of the Galactic Council, during humanity's most significant diplomatic moment in history. He was reading a book about, and I checked the cover when he passed me, the migratory patterns of a Terran bird called a starling. I fell into step behind them, because it is my job to guide new delegates to the waiting chamber before the opening address begins. This is normally a silent walk, a contemplative walk, a walk during which the weight of the cosmos settles onto the new species' shoulders and they begin to understand just how small and young they truly are. Fyodor Belkin asked me if I had ever seen a murmuration. I said I did not know what that was. Itsawan Talis Poldman Tor Pluv. He spent the next 4 minutes explaining with enormous enthusiasm how thousands of starlings fly together in shifting, rolling patterns across the sky. He had opinions about it, strong opinions. He had a theory about collective intelligence that he was very eager to share. He drew a small diagram in the margin of his book. I am 42 cycles old. I have a doctorate in interspecies diplomatic protocol. I spent 6 years studying the precise way to walk through this hallway, and I was getting a lesson about birds. We reached the waiting chamber. I seated them. I explained carefully and slowly as the procedure requires that the opening address would begin in 1 standard hour, that silence was expected, and that under no circumstances were delegates permitted to speak, react, eat, record or move unnecessarily during the address. Amara Osei nodded, composed, perfectly diplomatic. Fyodor Belkin had already gone back to his book. Kesi Oduya looked up from her device for the first time since entering the station, looked directly at me and said, "Does the Council have a Wi-Fi network or is everything hardwired?" I told her that the Council's communication systems were secured, restricted, and not accessible to new delegates until after formal admission. She nodded slowly. She looked back at her device. She typed something. I had a feeling she was not taking notes about the opening address. The hour passed. The grand session hall filled. 412 species, represented by over 2,000 delegates gathered in a space large enough to hold a small moon. The light shifted to the ceremonial amber. The council speakers took their positions. Grand Arbiter Shennok Vel, who has led every opening address for the past 200 years, rose to the podium. The hall went silent. Shennok Vel has a voice like a geological event. When he speaks, you feel it in your secondary organs, which, yes, I am aware humans do not have, but the point stands. He opened with the first words. The ancient phrase in Proto-Galactic that has begun every admission ceremony since the founding. Keth vor Allah. You who arrive from the dark, arrive now into light. It was perfect. It was exactly as it always was. The weight of history settled over the room like a warm, ancient blanket. And then Fyodor Belkin said, very quietly but unfortunately not quietly enough, "Oh, that's nice. Very poetic." 2,000 alien delegates turned to look at the human table. Amara Osei closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. I have reviewed the footage multiple times. Exactly 2 seconds. The precise duration of someone deciding whether to address a problem or simply survive it. She chose survival. She put her hand on Fyodor's arm. He looked up from his book. He looked at the 2,000 faces staring at him. He gave a small, friendly wave. The Durvok High Chancellor, who sits in the row directly behind the new delegate table, later told me it was the single most alarming hand gesture he had ever witnessed. He had thought it was a threat display. Grand Arbiter Shennok Vel, who has conducted this ceremony for 2 centuries, paused, looked at the human table, looked at his notes, and then, because he is a professional of the highest order, continued the opening address exactly as written. For 40 minutes it went smoothly. The humans were quiet. Amara took notes. Fyodor finished his chapter and moved to the next one. Kesi typed constantly on her device. Then came the passage of Remembrance, the section of the address that honors those species who were invited to the council but did not survive long enough to attend. The Morkai, the Selno, the twin people of Veth, each name read in silence, followed by the traditional response, spoken by all delegates in unison. They walked the same stars. We carry them forward. 2,000 voices, all at once. Trained for this, practiced for this. Humans had been given the response text in their briefing packet. The unified response rang through the hall, and then, half a second after everyone else finished, one additional voice said, with genuine feeling and a slight Terran accent, "God rest them." Fyodor Belkin, eyes closed, book pressed to his chest, paying his respects to 4 species he had never heard of, 12 hours ago with the same energy a human gives to the funeral of a beloved neighbor. The hall was very, very quiet. High Adjudicator Messator, who sits on my left during these proceedings, leaned over and whispered to me, "Is he mourning them?" I said I believed so. I believed so. Akalbisas Buscavodem Mestrio will lardok the potoplika pedinal Buscavodem. Not all bar. Messator was quiet for a moment, then she said, "That is either the most inappropriate thing I have ever witnessed or the most sincere." Before I could answer, Kesi Oduya looked up from her device, glanced around at the silence, looked at Fyodor and said, "Bless you, you absolute disaster." And somewhere, in the upper observation ring, where I could not see them, something that sounded very much like a plecary delegate suppressed a laugh. This was only the first hour. The opening address had 5 more to go, and Grand Arbiter Shennok Vel had just made the one mistake that would define the rest of the session. He looked at the human table. He made direct eye contact with Kesi Oduya. She waved back. Same wave Fyodor had done. Shennok Vel, 200 years old, veteran of 400 admissions, cleared his throat and continued. But I noticed in all my years of watching this man, for the very first time, he had lost his place in the text. Something was happening to the Galactic Council, something that did not have a name yet. The humans had arrived, and they had absolutely no idea, not even the smallest suspicion, that the entire galaxy was already watching them like a species watches a fire, unsure whether it will warm the room or burn the building down. I, Voruk, senior observer, 42 cycles of service, have a personal rule: never predict what a new species will do next. It creates false confidence. False confidence creates embarrassment, and embarrassment, in the Grand Session Hall of the Galactic Council, is permanent. The records are detailed, the archives are thorough. Every foolish moment lives forever in 17 different languages. I had already broken my rule 3 times in the first hour. I told myself, after Fyodor's funeral blessing and Kesi's wave at the Grand Arbiter, that the worst was behind us. The humans would settle. They would read the room, Even species with no diplomatic training eventually understand that silence is the safest policy in a room full of beings who have been making policy for 4,000 years. This belief lasted approximately 9 minutes. The opening address had reached the segment of structural governance. This is the section where the Council explains in precise and careful terms how decisions are made, how votes are weighted, how disputes are escalated, and how new members are expected to behave during their first cycle of observation. New delegates do not vote. New delegates do not speak in open session. New delegates listen, learn, absorb. Grand Arbiter Shennok was walking through the voting tier system. Species ranked by longevity of membership, diplomatic contribution, and territorial standing. He reached the section on new members. Species admitted in the current cycle, he said, in that geological voice of his, are granted observer status. Observer delegates are seated at the lower table. Observer delegates hold no voting rights. Observer delegates may submit written questions to the Council Secretariat, which will be reviewed within 40 standard rotations. 40 rotations. That is approximately 14 Terran months, by the way. Kesi Oduya raised her hand. I felt something cold move through my secondary organs. Shennok looked at her. The entire hall looked at her. New delegates do not raise hands. New delegates do not interact with the address. The address is not a conversation. It has never been a conversation. It is 4,000 years old, and it has never once been interrupted by a hand. Shennok, to his extraordinary credit, said, "Yes." Kesi Oduya said, 14 months for a written question. Is there a faster option? Like a support ticket system, or a direct line? The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence. Not the silence of offense. Not the silence of shock. It was the silence of 2,000 beings simultaneously trying to process a question that had never in 4,000 years of operation occurred to anyone to ask. Shennok said, "There is not." Kesi Oduya nodded, typed something, said, "Okay, I'll build one." Amara Osei put both hands flat on the table in front of her, looked straight ahead and breathed slowly through her nose. I recognized this. I had seen it before. It is what diplomats do when they are choosing to survive rather than react. Fyodor Belkin looked up from his book, looked at Kesi, looked at Shennok, looked at the room and said, perfectly calmly, "She will too. Just so you know. She built our shuttle's navigation system during a layover. High adjudicator." Messator wrote something in her notes. I glanced over. She had written, "Humans operate on different timescale assumptions. Investigate." The address continued. For 40 minutes it was fine. Genuinely fine. I started to relax. I noticed Amara Osei had written 14 pages of detailed notes. I noticed Fyodor had finished his book and was now staring at the ceiling with what I can only describe as peaceful contentment. I noticed Kesi had stopped typing and appeared to be running calculations on her device. What calculations? I did not know. I chose not to know. Then we reached the Compact of Shared Skies. The Compact is the binding agreement every species signs upon admission. It covers resource use, territorial boundaries, conflict escalation protocols, and the foundational principle of the Council, which is that no member species shall act unilaterally in a way that endangers the collective. The signing is ceremonial. It is symbolic. Every species signs it. No species has ever questioned it at the signing table. Amara Osei stood to accept the Compact scroll. Perfectly composed, perfectly prepared. She took the scroll from the ceremonial keeper, unrolled it, read the first section, and then very quietly said, "I have a question about Clause 17. Messator dropped her stylus. I looked at my datapad. I found Clause 17. I had never actually read Clause 17. Nobody reads Clause 17. Clause 17 is about preemptive threat neutralization, a clause added 400 years ago after a conflict with a species that no longer exists, and it had not been relevant since. Amara Osei read it aloud, in clear, precise Terran-accented galactic standard, to 2,000 delegates. Member species retain the right to act in preemptive self-defense if sufficient threat evidence is presented to a single council arbiter pending review. She paused. Pending review by how many arbiters? In what time frame? With what standard of evidence? And who defines sufficient? The hall was so quiet I could hear the Dervak High Chancellor behind me breathing slightly too fast. Shennok looked at Amara Osei. He looked at his compact. He looked at his senior legal adjudicator, a six-limbed being named Oroteth, who has been the Council's legal authority for 80 years. Oroteth looked back at him with an expression I had never seen on Oroteth's face before. Uncertainty, Oroteth said slowly. The standard review process involves 3 arbiters. Within the standard review window, Amara Osei said, which is how long? Oroteth said, it is not specified in the compact text. Amara Osei said very politely, then we would like that specified before signing, please. She set the scroll down on the table. She folded her hands. She waited. 2,000 delegates stared at the human table. Then they stared at Shennok Vel. Then they stared at Oroteth. Then they all looked, in a slow, gradual, tidal wave of attention at Clause 17, which had been in the compact for 400 years, and which apparently nobody had read carefully enough to notice was completely and utterly unenforceable as written. Fyodor Belkin, reading absolutely nothing in the room, said brightly, "Is there a break coming? I found a very interesting anomaly in the station's ventilation pattern, and I'd love to take a look." Nobody answered him. Messator leaned over to me and said, very quietly, "Did a species that has been in space for 11 years just find a legal hole in a document that has governed the galaxy for 4 centuries?" I said, very quietly back, "Yes." She said, "In the first session," I said. "In the first session." She stared at the humans for a long moment. Then she said, "Voruk, I think we've been doing this wrong." The session was paused. Formally, for the first time in documented history, Shennok Vel announced a recess of 2 standard hours while the legal council reviewed Clause 17. 2,000 delegates filed out into the corridor. Many of them were talking. Many of them were looking back at the human table. During the recess, I found the 3 humans standing near a viewport overlooking the galactic arm. Amara Osei was reviewing her notes. Fyodor Belkin had found the ventilation panel he mentioned and had it partially removed. A maintenance drone was watching him with what I can only interpret as alarm. Kesi Oduya was on a communication link, speaking to someone back on Earth. I could not hear the full conversation. I heard the words, "Yes, the ticket system will work. I already sketched the architecture." And then, before I stepped away, "Also they have a legal clause that hasn't been defined in 400 years, so that was fun." I went to find Shennok Vel. I found him in the Arbiter's private chamber with Oroteth and 4 senior legal delegates, all of them reading Clause 17 and none of them looking particularly comfortable. Shennok Vel looked at me when I entered. He said, "You were the attending observer." I said, "Yes, Grand Arbiter." He said, "In 42 cycles, have you ever seen anything like this?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "No, Grand Arbiter." He looked back at the compact. He said, "They are not disruptive. They are not hostile. They are not performing." He paused. "They simply think the way they think, and they cannot stop." I said, "The female one, Kesi Oduya, mentioned building a communication system for the council during the session." Shennok Vel looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Would it work?" I said, "Probably." He turned back to Clause 17. The recess ended. The session resumed. Oroteth, with the energy of someone who has just spent 2 hours being quietly embarrassed, announced that Clause 17 would be amended within the next standard rotation to include defined review timelines and evidence standards. The hall absorbed this. Amara Osei said, "Thank you," picked up the scroll and signed the Compact of Shared Skies. It was done. Humanity was admitted to the Galactic Council. The hall gave the traditional admission response, which is a formal tone played through the station's resonance system, and then Fyodor Belkin started clapping, just applauding, hands together, looking around at the room encouragingly, as though 2,000 alien species might join in if given enough time. 3 Placari delegates, who had been watching the humans with barely contained delight for 6 hours, joined in. Brief, confused applause. Then it stopped. Fyodor nodded approvingly. "Good enough," he said. Humanity was at last a member of the Galactic Council. I filed my observer report that evening. I am required to give a summary assessment of every new species in their first session. I have written 347 of these reports. They are formal. They are structured. They follow a template that has existed for 200 years. I stared at the template for a long time. Then I wrote the following. Species designation. Human. Terran origin. Admitted without incident. I paused. I deleted without incident. I wrote, admitted. The compact has been improved. Recommend immediate review of all foundational documents for similar structural gaps. Recommend fast-track communication infrastructure upgrade, suggested by the Human Technical Advisor. Recommend additional observer staffing for all future human delegation sessions. Then I added one final line, which is not in the template, and which I have never added to any report before. I do not know what they will do next. Nobody does. This is, I believe, the point. I submitted the report. Outside my office viewport, the stars looked the same as they always had. Ancient, unchanging, patient, but somewhere on this station, Kesi Oduya was already sketching the architecture of something new. Fyodor Belkin was reading about birds, and Amara Osei was writing 14 pages of follow-up questions that the Council had, as of today, 400 years of catching up to answer. The galaxy had been turning slowly for a very long time. I had a feeling that was about to change. And honestly, after 42 cycles of watching empires walk carefully and speak in whispers, it was about time.